Good morning, and thank you for joining us in kicking off the 4th Annual Early Ed Week 2021. My name is Dr. Libby Saunier, and I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children. I'm honored to welcome all of you to our keynote address this morning. We appreciate everyone's patience as we have had to pivot to a virtual format this year in order to foster the safest possible program in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Before we go any further, I'd like to recognize the title sponsor for Louisiana Early Ed Week 2021. This week would not be possible without the generous support we've received from Entergy. During today's event and throughout the week, we invite you to share your participation on social media using the hashtag LA Early Ed Week. At this time, it's my great honor to introduce our Louisiana State Superintendent of Education, Dr. Cade Brumley, who will get us started and introduce today's esteemed keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Saunier. So excited about Early Ed Week here in Louisiana. You know, for some time I have shared that the greatest educational challenge of our generation, in my mind, is early childhood education. And we have to make sure that we have a coordinated team effort in order to make sure that we are investing in early childhood education, but also making sure that that investment leads to high quality programming for all kids. So as we kick off Early Ed Week in Louisiana, we need to think about the focus of the week. It's about raising awareness for the need for early education in the great state of Louisiana and the benefits of early education in the great state of Louisiana. And our office is happy to partner with this agency to do this very important work. We know that our kids in Louisiana are just as capable as kids anywhere in this nation. We know that our educators are just as capable as any educators in this nation. And we know that we can and will do more to make sure that our kids are ready on day one of kindergarten to be successful. Right now, our data indicate that only 40% of kids in Louisiana are ready on day one with the critical skills they need to be successful. And we can do more. And in order to do more, we need to learn from the best in this field so that we can have the tools and resources necessary to implement best practice in the state of Louisiana. And that's why today I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jack Shonkoff. He is an esteemed pediatrician and the director of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. He is an esteemed national expert, and we're fortunate to hear from him today. He will tell us about some of his previous experiences and how the science of early education should drive our practice and our policy. At this time, Dr. Jack Shonkoff.
Thanks very much, Dr. Brumley. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. And sorry I'm not there in person, but we'll do our best with this virtual format. So let's just jump right onto the presentation. And so to tell you a little bit of what I'm going to do in this first part of the session is to give you a crash course in 21st century science, which is really a very rapidly moving frontier, and show how it can really be used to strengthen the foundations not only of early learning, but also lifelong health, and particularly thinking of this in a post-COVID-19 world, which is where we all hope to be quite soon. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of a framework for how to think about my comments, there are really three lenses that converge that I use to think about investment in the early childhood period. Next, the first is this notion of social responsibility. This is the largest, biggest tent we could possibly set up for early childhood. There isn't anyone who lives in our communities and our society who doesn't at some level understand the importance of us all sharing responsibility for the well-being of every child. It's really in our self-interest, and it's also an important value that we hold very sincerely. Next, there's also a hard-nosed human capital development issue here, and this is not in competition with the first circle. They go hand in hand. We've shown over and over again what a good investment it is to put resources into the early years and build the foundation for human capital, which we all benefit from and we all depend upon. And what I'm going to do this morning is talk about the third circle next, which is not just the value of science being at the table. I think anyone who has had any involvement in the early childhood world, particularly around early childhood education, understands that there's a very important science base here. But what I'd like to do this morning, and particularly because of all the exciting possibilities in Louisiana, is talk about how some of the newer science really represents an untapped resource to really take the best of what we're doing right now and raise it to another level. And I know that Louisiana is primed for that under your leadership, Dr. Brumley, and under your leadership, Dr. Sonnier, and others. So this is my honor to be part of this conference that you're holding over this period of time right now. So next, please. First, let me say a little bit about the science framework that has been guiding early childhood policies and services for actually more than 50 years in this country. And that basic science that drives what we do right now has remained conceptually sound over more than half a century. But its impact has been variable. We have circumstances where we make huge impacts and others where we still face challenges. So next, please. This basic scientific framework says that some combination of enriched learning experiences for children, education and support for their parents, primary health care, sound nutrition, health promoting environments, and community empowerment all together result in children coming to school ready to succeed. Most of this, a good deal of it, is provided by families themselves. It's provided in communities by informal relationships and faith-based organizations, and in some cases, publicly supported programs that provide what families either no family could provide on its own, or that some families need more support for. And basically, this works for a significant part of the population. But next, please. There is a part of the population that faces significant adversity related to poverty, the inequities related to racism, exposure to violence, a variety of other significant sources of stress and adversity that overwhelm the ability of what early childhood programs and families and healthcare can do on its own in normal circumstances. And as a result, we have some part of the population in which now we tend to think of what we call whole child development, not just early literacy and competence in arithmetic, but also social and emotional development, and as I'm going to share with you this morning, physical and mental health. That there is a part of the population who need more than what we're doing right now. And the question is, what do we do about that? Because we're not starting from ground zero, and we've made huge progress, and we make a big difference in the lives of many children. But what about those children who are coming to school under your auspices, Dr. Brumley, and need more than what a typical classroom can provide? So if I could go to the next slide, this is going to be your crash course in 21st century biology. Okay, we're going to try in just a few minutes to give you the highlights of what we know now that is beyond where we were even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and certainly well beyond where we were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So what the frontiers of biology are doing for us right now is that they're really deepening our understanding of the origins, the early origins of disparities in learning and behavior and in health. I'm going to just briefly discuss three core concepts that I want you to leave here with that will give you a sense of where we are now and where the science is going. So the first concept, next, is the need to connect the brain to the rest of the body. I'm going to take it as a given that most, if not all of you, have heard what has been an important focus of discussion in the early childhood years for at least the last 10 to 20 years, which is how early experiences literally shape the architecture of the developing brain. I think most people have heard in one degree or another about how early experiences build strong brain circuits, this kind of serve and return interaction that children have, very young children have with the adults who care for them, and that significant stress and adversity, and at its extreme, what we call toxic stress, can disrupt brain circuits and affect the foundations of early learning. But what the science is now telling us is, guess what, folks? The brain is connected to the rest of the body, and that early experiences, early exposures are affecting not only brain development, but the development of the immune system, the development of metabolic regulatory systems. And so actually, in many cases, with minimal changes, what we're doing to promote early learning is also promoting the foundations of physical and mental health. For the same nickel, we can get both, okay? But we really need to pay more attention to it. And I'm sure, Dr. Brumley, you will appreciate my comments here that the cost of the preparation for success in school should not be borne just by the education system. The healthcare budget should be paying for part of this as well, because we're all benefiting from that. So that's the first message here. This is still very much about impact on early brain development, but it's also on all the other biological systems. So let me go to the next slide, the next clip, please. Second concept is the critical importance of variation and sensitivity to the environment. This is one of the products of the Human Genome Project that cracked the genetic code and that we now understand at a molecular level about genetic variation. This is not about group differences. This is about individual differences. So science is telling us that everything about early learning, emotional and social development, physical health, mental health, everything is dependent on an interaction between each child's unique genetic predispositions and the environment in which you live and the experiences you have. This gets very detailed, right down to the molecular level. I'll bring it right to the point where everyone in the audience can understand. For those of you who have children and have more than one child, for those of you who come from a family with more than one child, for those of you who know somebody who lives in a family with more than one child, every parent will tell you that two children may live in the same home, but they're not the same, and that they respond differently to the environment they're in. Some are more sensitive to what's going on in the environment. Some are just kind of more whatever. They kind of roll with whatever goes and everything in between. This is the essential nature of human biology. So we can't talk just in generalities about, so what's the impact of poverty on children? It varies. What's the impact of violence exposure? It varies. What's the impact of our interventions? What about our programs? They vary. So one of the things that science is really screaming at us is stop asking what's the best program. Start asking what's working best for what kinds of children and families, and what's not working as well and therefore needs to be modified to get equal benefits for others. This is a really important issue. It's grounded in very sophisticated science, and it's also what everybody's grandmother could tell you and what everybody who works in the early childhood field understands. The best of what we do doesn't work the same for everyone. And we have spoken in the field always about there's no one size fits all. Well, science has caught up to us and said now we have to live through that. We can't just ask what's the best curriculum. Moving now, next, please, to the third principle, which is the critical importance of timing and critical periods, and the fact that the adaptability and the plasticity of the brain is at its height when the brain is very immature, and as the brain develops, as it gets more complex in its circuitry, as it becomes more competent in dealing with a wide variety of capabilities, its flexibility and adaptability decrease. We all know that. That's part of the rhetoric that's been present in the field for a long time about why early is so important. It's better to get the circuitry right the first time than try to fix it later. You can't go back. Life is a one-way street. During critical periods when certain features are being developed, that's the time that they are most susceptible to positive experiences and the time that they are most vulnerable to adverse experiences. But the same principle now we know doesn't just apply to the brain. It applies to the immune system. It applies to metabolic regulatory systems. We'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So this is why this increasing focus on the earlier years, and particularly the prenatal period and into the first 2 to 3 years after birth, are tremendously important. Pre-K for 4-year-olds and preschools for 3-year-olds are tremendously important. It's much better than starting for the first time at kindergarten. But for children facing the greatest adversity, that's not too late, but it's not early, and we need to start looking earlier. The science is screaming at us, look early for health as well as for learning and behavior. Next, please. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you under the skin and into the body and give you a little bit of a sense of where some of the science is behind this notion of how excessive stress gets under the skin and into the body and how it can affect the brain and other biological systems. So everything, there will be no quiz at the end of my presentation, but if you're ever given a test that asks you about anything related to learning, behavior, physical health, mental health, and it's a multiple choice question that says, so is this genetic? Is this about environment? Is it about something else, or is it about both? The correct answer is always D. It is always about both. So everything is a result of the interaction among genetics, the environment, and timing, the age at which the experiences are happening. So next, let me tell you now what's going on inside the body. All of us have a stress response system. It is our friend. I can't see any of you in the audience, but I know that every one of you, because you are regular people, you all know what severe stress feels like. It is a normal part of life. So think as I walk through this slide about moments when you have felt extremely stressed about something, and you know that it's not just in your head, it's all through your body. There are physical sensations about being stressed. So what's going on inside the body? When we are stressed, which is our body's way of protecting us and making us most capable for the flight or fight response, we're going to run or we're going to fight. We're going to optimally deal with whatever it is we're facing. Here's what's going on. Next. So first, stress hormones are released in the bloodstream, cortisol being one that's been studied the most, that basically help you become more alert and mobilize your energy stores. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. Next. Your inflammatory system is activated. This is your immune system preparing to fight infection if you're wounded, for wound healing and repair. Inflammation mobilizes the body's response to outside invasions. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Next, your metabolic system starts to mobilize energy sources. Your blood sugar goes up. You're optimally ready to deal with stress. Next. There are all kinds of things going on, no time to talk about them now, but changes in actually at the molecular level, different chemical reactions that actually turn some genes on, turn some genes off, and affect the rate at which your body can respond to all of these processes. And if I can have the next click, also brain circuitry and electrical activity in the brain is activated. All of these things are interacting with each other. This is good for us. This is life-saving in a life-threatening situation. This is how we respond optimally when stressed and challenged. But here's the problem. That system was meant to be ramped up in the face of an acute threat and then go back to baseline after you deal with the stress. It was not made to stay up most of the time at a high level over prolonged periods. So what happens is if you're living with constant stress related to poverty, related to discrimination, related to constant exposure to violence, and your stress system is activated most of the time. Next, please, I'll mention a few. So stress hormones, which made you more alert and able to kind of deal with an acute circumstance, if they stay elevated for prolonged periods of time, they start to actually disrupt the formation in very young brains of the very circuits that we need for executive function and self-regulation and to respond to fear and to have simple memory intact. So when these hormones stay up, they actually undermining parts of the brain that are developing the ability to focus and sustain your attention. And so children who at very early in life have constant elevations of stress hormones have more trouble focusing their attention later, are more distractible, and have more difficulty regulating their behavior, not because of their attitudes, but because their brain circuits early on were not as sturdy in these areas as they could have been. It's something that you can remediate later, but it costs more money, costs more energy. It would never be as good as it would have been had we moderated this right from the beginning and gotten them right. Next, inflammation. Inflammation is one of the underlying factors that explains many of the chronic diseases that are not equally distributed across the population and most common among people who've experienced significant stress. Inflammation accelerates atherosclerosis and makes it more likely you're going to get heart disease. Inflammation is associated with cognitive decline and make you more at risk later in life for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Arthritis, many of the chronic inflammatory diseases that we see in adulthood that cost a lot of money are caused by inflammation, and elevated inflammation early in life that's persistent may be helping us open up that black box and understand, why do kids who live under extreme adversity, why do they have more health problems when they grow up? Why do they have more addictions? And why do they look older than they are? It's that wear and tear effect of inflammation. Next, metabolic regulation. Elevated blood sugar is great when you're stressed. It's great when you have to fight. It's great when you have to run. It's great when your brain needs a lot of energy, but if it stays up too high, too long, you develop insulin resistance and you get metabolic syndrome, and you're more likely to become obese and you're more likely to get diabetes and all of the complications. So the message here is that now that we're finding out more about what's going on inside the body, we understand how this happens. What is it about early adversity that leads to problems in school and problems in health? We understand that more now. We can do more about that. And the answer is we need to move these stress levels down. We need to buffer children from high levels of stress, and we need to build their resilience. You're not born with resilience, it's built. We need to build their coping capacities to deal with stress so we can protect their developing brains and their developing organ systems and other parts of their body. Next. So we have to recognize the fact that there's been a huge amount of shining a bright light over the past year in the context of this pandemic and the increased consciousness about the impacts of racism. We understand that disruptions in baseline daily activities are not equally distributed across the population, and that communities of color and children of color experience more stress than other groups. Okay. Next, we know that, next please. We know that financial hardships are more prevalent in Black families and in Latinx families compared to white families. Next, we know that families living in communities that have higher minority populations, children are experienced to more neighborhood violence. We know if we look at the long list of sources of adversity early in life, next please, across the board, on average, children of color experiencing 2 or more adversities much more frequently than white children. This is not something that the children create. In many cases, it is beyond the control of their families, and yet these levels of chronic adversity are affecting family life. They are affecting the extent to which families can protect their children from these sources of stress. And now you can finish the rest of this paragraph about what is happening inside the bodies of children whose stress systems are chronically activated. Next slide, please. So this notion of the importance of starting very early is caught up in this concept of what we call plasticity, neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to adapt and to also be responsive optimally to outside environments. So next, please. This is the sad truth of normal brain development. Brain plasticity, the ability to adapt, the ability to develop new skills, is optimal when we are born, is at its highest level. It drops rather precipitously in the early childhood years. Then the pace of decrease in plasticity decreases somewhat. And then next, please. What this means is that the actual physiological effort, the cost to the brain in this case, of having to adapt new capacities and adapt to new challenges goes up the older you get because your brain is just kind of less adaptable. Now, the first thing everyone does when this slide goes up is you look for your own age to see kind of, so how am I doing? Okay, this is, but take heart. If you notice, I mean, the slide is only so wide, it goes up to age 80. It could go to age 100, it could go to age 110. What I want to point out to you is that it never gets down to 0 until you're dead. So we always have the capacity to learn. We always have the capacity to develop new skills. It's just that it's harder as you get older. It costs more energy for the body. It costs more money for society. Better to get it right early, and particularly to build on a strong foundation. This is another basic scientific principle that explains why early is so important. This is not just about being big-hearted and feeling good. This is hard science. The earlier we get things right, the easier it is for everything that comes afterward. Next, please. So I want to say a little bit about the level of consciousness that we have as a society as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic that we've all been struggling to live through over the past year. And to look at the pandemic and to look about the issue of inequality in the pandemic through an early childhood lens. Just kind of 3 points that I want to put out there for thought. Next. So disparities associated with poverty, racism, and other structural inequities are not new. We did not discover in the COVID-19 pandemic the inequities that exist, particularly related to the much higher prevalence of health problems in populations of color. But the striking variations in susceptibility to the illness in response to treatment underscore this critical point. It goes back to differential variation in susceptibility to the environment. Okay, now we all know there's been a lot of attention in the press to the fact that one reason why we see higher rates of infection, higher rates of serious complications in infection, and higher death rates is because more people of color are in jobs that don't allow them to work from home, live in overcrowded housing that makes it easier for infection to spread, rely more on public transportation where it's harder to distance yourself. All of that has gotten a lot of attention. It's really important. And it has a lot to do with adults and how kind of adults live. And also we've paid a lot of attention to the fact that pre-existing medical conditions like hypertension and obesity and diabetes and heart disease make you particularly vulnerable to be sicker if you're infected and more likely to die. But basically, that's not new news. Okay, next, please. What is new news and what needs to get more attention as we go forward, and is an important issue for the early childhood field more broadly, is that the origins of disparities in health and educational achievement that we see in adults begin in the earliest years. If you can remember one of my earlier slides about the extent to which inflammation and elevated stress hormones and elevated blood sugar are part of the stress response, you can now begin to connect the dots and say, it's not genetics, and it's not kind of simply chance that more adults of color have more diabetes and hypertension, obesity. So some people say, well, it has to do with diet and lifestyle, which is obviously a contributing factor, but the roots of these illnesses start very early in life, well before children are making life choices about their lifestyle. It has to do with the impact in your body of constant elevation of stress. And this is where the relative invisibility of infants and toddlers in the midst of this pandemic are a huge price that we are all going to pay a tremendous amount for later. Understandably, when it comes to children, most of the attention has been put on the need to get children back to school. It's obviously very important. And also the impact on preschool programs and childcare centers that have had to struggle with the impacts of the pandemic. But very little attention is being paid to infants and toddlers who are kind of home with families dealing with variable levels of stress. And you now know, this is one of the prices you pay for the information I'm sharing with you, is you can't now walk away and say, well, not much is going on with those infants. I mean, as long as they're being fed, and for many families, that itself is a challenge now. As long as they're being fed and bathed and paid attention to, everything's going to be okay. Well, for many children, that's true. But for some children, the risks are actually already getting very high because of what's going on in terms of the stress that their families are dealing with, just barely getting by, meeting basic needs. So next, this is the one summary take-home message, not only from what we can learn from the epidemic. Can I have the next click, please? But also a basic principle of child development is, if we want to focus on the health and well-being of young children in a pandemic or at any other time under, quote, normal circumstances, the health and well-being of young children is inextricably tied to the health and well-being of the adults who care for them. So right now, if we're saying, what should we be doing to protect early learning and the health of very young children, make sure we are meeting the needs of the parents who are taking care of them isolated at home, and make sure we take care of the needs of the adults who are caring for them in early care and education programs. That is the key to providing all that's needed in its essence for building strong foundations for young children in their brain development and in their physical health. Next, please. So there's a lot more. I just have given you kind of, the bumper sticker summaries of some of these important scientific principles. But of course, for this conference and for the work that all of you do and the challenges that all of you face in the policy world, the real important question is, don't tell me just about this kind of really cool science, but what do I do with it? How do I make it actionable? And what we have done in our center is to try to take this very complex science and turn it into very actionable principles that can be used to have science guide what you do to either strengthen existing policies and programs, to design and test some new ideas about how to address some of the particular problems that are less amenable and the challenges that are less amenable to the programs we have now, or even to come up with some new ideas. And there are basically 3 science-based principles that come from what I've shared with you so far in this presentation that can be used to strengthen the foundations of healthy development across every policy and program sector that touches families with young children. So this is obviously a huge issue for the education sector and for early education, but it's no less important for health sectors and services, no less important for human services, child welfare, variety of parent supports, economic development, dare I say, housing, food security policies and programs. All of them have a role to play in strengthening the foundations of early learning and health around 3 simple principles. The first one, next, is the need to support responsive relationships. Responsive, nurturing relationships between young children and the important adults who care for them are the active ingredients of what we mean by the impact of the environment on young children. I mean, we talk in terms of communities, in terms of resources, in terms of programs, but at the end of the day, government doesn't raise children, communities don't raise children, adult caregivers, starting with their parents, raise children, and all of these other factors can strengthen the ability of parents and families to provide a growth-promoting and learning-promoting environment, and it all happens through responsive relationships. Responsive relationships calm down the stress response. The absence of responsive relationships activates the stress response. When young children are not in an environment of predictable, stable, responsive relationships, it's not a matter of what they understand. Their body senses the lack of responsiveness as literally a life-threatening stress and activates all of these stress response systems. So that is key. And we could ask of every policy and program, how is it supporting relationships and how is it undermining them? That includes relationships between adults in terms of how programs and services interact with families. Next, the second principle is reducing sources of stress. I think any one of you can get up and give the next part of this presentation. There are so many sources of stress in everyone's life, and sources of stress are normative, most of them. There are some stress sources that are well beyond what we consider to be normal stresses. We have to address those, the stresses of poverty, the stresses of discrimination and racism, the stresses of violence exposure. The issue is not to eliminate stress, it's to reduce sources of stress and to make them manageable. And that brings me to the last principle. Next, please, is to strengthen core skills. There are basic core skills that we all have as adults that allow us to be successful, whether it be as parents, as employees, as contributing citizens in a community. This is the ability to engage in goal-directed behavior, to focus your attention, to control your impulses, to set goals, to work toward those goals, to shift from plan A to plan B when things don't work, because they don't always work, to delay gratification. These are all fall into the category of what we call self-regulation, executive function skills. They are the essence of resilience. The foundations of these skills start in the early childhood years. They don't come in automatically. It's not like sitting and crawling and walking. They come in by being modeled and scaffolded by the adults who care for young children. Adults help scaffold the ability to focus your attention, to regulate your behavior, to control your impulses. And so when adults who care for children don't have these skills as strong adaptive capacities of their own, they can be developed by coaching. They can be developed by practice. They don't get developed by getting a cheat sheet that tells you, focus your attention, control your impulses, regulate your behavior. It has to be done by coaching. And the beautiful thing about coaching and practice is it's not a deficit model. Elite athletes have coaches and they practice all the time. All of us can be better all the time, but these skills are the key to basically providing a well-regulated environment in which healthy development and optimal learning takes place. And they help children to develop their own coping capacities over time. So I'm going to leave with a special shout out to the important question that's always asked, if I could have the next slide, by people. Well, first, let me just say, thank you. I forgot about this. The devil is in the details of these. It's easy to say, support relationships, reduce stress, strengthen skills. And all of us would say, well, yeah, great. So thank you for telling me that. That's what we do. How come it's not working all the time? And the answer is because the devil is in the details. The concepts are simple, but the implementation requires understanding timing, understanding the importance of developmental stages, and understanding variation in how children and adults develop. Next slide. So this is my final shout out for those of you, and I have to say I have huge respect for the role that you play, who say, this is really important, I hear it, I understand it, but these things are expensive, we have just so much money to go around. I am totally sympathetic to that. There is never enough money to do all the things we want to do. And cases have been made over the years. Jim Heckman probably been the most prominent economist from the University of Chicago, to talk about the return on investment to society, not just to children who get high quality early childhood services, but the return on investment to society by high quality early educational experiences. Less special education costs, less grade repetition, more kids graduate high school, although a high school diploma used to be the key to a good job. It's not as much of a key as it used to be. You need more now. And less incarceration, all of those things. I think anybody in the early childhood field is familiar with those data and the fact that we get more money back for what we put in. The problem is we have to wait a while for that. If we want, if you invest in programs for infants or 3 and 4-year-olds, and you say, well, how long do I have to wait to see high school graduation rates go up? And the last time I checked, you have to wait until the kids get old enough to graduate high school. You're not going to see it in a year or two. But there's another important issue here, which is the health issue, right? And so this is what I want to leave you with, to say those of you in the education field, you need to be partnering and you need the support of people who have all that money in the healthcare budgets as well, because early childhood investments that protect developing biological systems from toxic stress will generate substantially greater return on investment in healthcare costs later. So next. 3 of the 5 most costly adult diseases are associated with early life adversity. Look at how much money we spend, almost $300 billion a year on heart disease. Next, we spend over $200 billion a year on diabetes. Next, we spend almost $100 billion a year on depression. This starts to add up to a fair amount of money. If you put the healthcare savings alongside the savings in incarceration and the savings in more people gainfully employed and paying taxes rather than relying on public assistance, we have huge returns on investment. This is the human capital investment. And so my parting message to you is not only is early childhood programming critically important for improving children's readiness to come to school ready to succeed, but it also has huge impacts beyond that on the other part of human capital, which is physical and mental health. And there's huge potential savings down the road. So we've got not only a lot of work to do, but we've got more knowledge and more untapped scientific insights that now need to be brought to the table at the policy level and the program level to kind of really dramatically increase the magnitude of the effects of what we've been achieving so far in the early childhood space. So I will stop right here. The next slide, the last one, is let's go to the next. This is the URL for the website for our center, for those of you who have not been on there. If you want more information, if you want to go deeper into some of this science, we have a huge amount of material there that makes complicated science accessible to non-scientists, and I would invite you to go browsing. Anyway, I will stop right here, stop where I began, which is to thank you all for the opportunity to be part of this program, and turn this back to you, Libby, for Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack, and also to Dr. Brumley as well for being with us today. We have a few questions that have just come up. The first one is, how do we really take care of the adults who are taking care of our children?
Yeah, what a great question. So actually, there are two parts to this. The first part is to make it easier for people who need help to ask for it, as opposed to feeling stigmatized or embarrassed to say, I need help. If there are any positive things that we could say come out of this pandemic, is that more and more people who prior to the pandemic did not have to ask for much help are asking for help now because they've lost their jobs, or they're in danger of losing their homes, or in danger of losing their apartments, and can't put food on the table. So I think all of us understand more, or should take advantage of this opportunity to realize how it's really important at times of need for us to provide help for families raising young children, and to make it not embarrassing or stigmatizing or humiliating to say, I need help. The second is to understand what are the kind of core foundational needs that families have. And so, the extent that we still battle back and forth in this country about whether we should provide help for access to food for people who can't have enough food to give their children. And then, of course, there's been a lot of attention to the mental health problems. We know that the prevalence of anxiety and depression among parents, particularly mothers, is not just a problem for people with low income. It cuts across the population. Very few parents, very, very few parents are not going to do anything they can for their kids. We have to make it acceptable, and we have to share responsibility for meeting the needs of people who care for kids. And people who have needs can articulate those needs. We just have to identify them.
I wonder too, I'm thinking back to one of your articles many years ago, Jack, talking about the infrastructure of the brain and caregivers and their levels of cortisol and how that passes on to children. And so this question reminds me of that body of work. And I'm wondering how we can explain that to the people that are listening today about the importance of taking care of themselves so that they don't pass on that stress to other children.
Right. Well, I think this is, again, I don't want to completely repeat what I just said before, but so a large part of this population is sufficiently educated to have to be employed at a level that meets your basic needs, and has both income and education to basically do well. And I think that we all understand now how nobody lives an anxiety-free life, right? And we all understand how when things get tough, people who started out at baseline at a lower level are really in the most serious trouble. But that none of us very few of us, let's say, are completely free of being overwhelmed at times by stress and anxiety. And so this is where it's very important to keep an appropriate balance, because everybody needs to leave this session understanding that young children are not doomed to a life of school failure and health problems. Okay? This is a matter of relative risk. And also understand that the one thing about biology, it is designed to keep us on track toward healthy outcomes. And when we go off track, it is automatically designed to try to get us back on track. It's like we just have to help that. We have to facilitate it. Even medicine, so much of medicine is helping the body heal when it is ill. Okay, it's not. So the real issue here is how understanding what's going on inside our bodies, understanding how the environment in which we live literally shapes the circuitry of our brain, literally affects the development of our immune system, literally affects our metabolic systems. We open that black box up, we see inside, and now we understand how adversity leads to problems, why kids living in poverty have more trouble in school, which now opens up how we could help, why we should help. Not just because, I think morally it's hard to walk away when you know this, but even from a more green shade, self-interest point of view from society, most of the problems we face in school are preventable, and they are kind of right there in front of us to deal with ahead of time. And aside from the benefits to the children, every child who doesn't get the help early on to be more likely to succeed in school is one less child multiplied by many, many, because adults are going to be fewer people able to pay for Medicare and Social Security and the interest on the national debt. This is something that everybody has a vested interest in. And the science is telling us it's not a mystery, and it's not magic that significant adversity early on leads to problems later. We understand more now than we ever did before how it's happening. And that should then be translated into what can we do? And it's more than just giving parents information and a pat on the back, right? It's in many cases saying, how do we structure the environments so that, I'm sorry for that disruption. How do we support home environments through good home visiting programs? How do we provide the right school-based preschool programs to basically promote healthy development, get those stress systems down, and build resilience while we're building literacy skills and arithmetic capability?
Absolutely. And that really, I think, leads into our next question, that is really about what is so critical about responsive relationships for young children too. And our Department of Education has spent a lot of time investing on the class system to really get teachers and caregivers to understand that relationship-based learning for children. But what's so critical about that responsive relationship?
It's a critical question, and it allows me to go right back to what biology is all about. Okay, so this is about how have our biological systems evolved to keep us alive. The thing about biology is, and by the way, I've had some wonderful conversations with people. I don't know if anybody in the audience is a believer in intelligent design rather than evolution. Right? Works both ways. I know I've spoken to people who believe in intelligent design and says what biology is all about is proof only God would come up with something this brilliant. Science is basically saying this is the result of evolution. In both cases, this is what it's all about. This is basic biology. Every animal species that doesn't go extinct. So the dinosaurs didn't make it, okay? But every animal species that doesn't go extinct is biologically designed to live long enough to reproduce. That's how biology works, right? It's like you have to be long enough to reproduce. And all other animals, the thing that differentiates humans from all other animal species is not just that our brains are so much far advanced compared to other animals, but we are helpless for the longest period of time after birth compared to other animals. I think for those of you who know more about animals, for many animals within weeks, they're independent, or maybe in some cases months, but not years. Some people might say, who might have, some people might say some humans don't become independent for decades, right? But basically, biologically, we are helpless for the first several years of our life. We can't feed ourselves in infancy. We can't. So biologically, if we are wired to expect and to depend upon responsive care and relationships. If they're not there, it's life-threatening. So biologically, we are wired to go haywire. All our stress systems are on high alert and highly activated if we're not consistently responded to, because our brain won't develop the circuits it needs to develop the skills that we need, because they don't come in on automatic pilot. They are shaped by this responsive relationship. So it's not just, oh, isn't it nice that parents, cuddle their kids and coo with them and sing them. No, it's like if you don't do that, and that doesn't have to be all the time. That's some people, panic that they're not. Kids can be left alone for periods of time. Right. But if there's no consistent or stable or predictable responsiveness, it triggers all of those biological stress responses I told you about. And as long as they come back to baseline, that's okay. But if you're not enjoying those responsive relationships most of the time, your stress system is activated most of the time, this is where this disruption is taking place early on. It's biologically necessary. It's not just a nice thing to watch.
And the greatest mechanism for learning at the end of the day. If children are really going to learn, they're going to learn in responsive relationships. Absolutely. Our next question is from Hamilton Simons Jones. He's saying, I have seen numbers of some of the social and economic impacts on the investment of early care and education or early childhood education. Has anybody ever combined the health data in those calculations? If so, where? If not, why?
Great question.
You know the answer, and I know the answer. So
great question. Well, let me put it this way to give myself some credibility. I am not aware of anyone having done that. That's different from me saying it's never been done, right? But I've never seen it. I'm not aware of it. It's something that obviously has to happen. It's something that we're working on very intently right now with healthcare economists. Obviously, the biggest problem is it's a long-term payback. It's not a short-term payback. But yes, I think that has to happen.
Jim Heckman has put some of that data in his equation on the return on investment. But again, we're still studying, if we think about Abecedarian, those kids are now 45 years old. So we're still learning the health benefits on their behalf too.
But this is what's important about this, Libby, and this is what the field needs to be careful about. So Abecedarian was one program that served 50 kids. And Perry Preschool was another program that served 50 kids and had 50 some odd kids in a control group. And it told us what's possible.
Right.
It's not the same as what do we achieve from programs that are taken to scale, serving thousands or millions of children. Right?
Absolutely.
That's number one. Number two is the healthcare system will not accept looking at a program that happened 40 years ago, doing a 40-year follow-up, getting some health data, finding a difference in blood pressure between two people, and saying that program caused the difference in blood pressure. It needs much more convincing evidence of that. This is the future of the return on investment part of early childhood. It hasn't been done. It will be done. There's no question that the potential returns on investment are mammoth. Everybody who's involved in policy knows that the health budget is the biggest budget buster of all of the money that we deal with, far exceeding what we spend on education.
Absolutely. We have a question from Leanne Bond up in Northeast Louisiana. Do you have examples of successful ways to shift the attitudes of mental health programs and supports when needed? And how do we break down the barriers of such things that are embarrassing?
Yeah, but you guys really have wonderful questions. So let me say, Leanne, that's a critical question that has plagued the health system for more than a century. This kind of stigma put on mental health relative to physical health, which makes no sense whatsoever. I'll say two things about that. One is this is a matter of public education. I think a lot of the science now is showing that the only difference between a mental health problem and a physical health problem is which organ is affected, right? It's not like physical health problems are real and mental health problems are just in your mind, right? They all have a biological basis, but that's a long way from public kind of acceptance and understanding. But I'll give you one example of where people have made an important difference. We put a lot of attention on the importance of screening for maternal depression in early infancy. It's a serious problem. It's highly prevalent, and it clearly interferes with the ability to be consistently responsive to a baby. It has nothing to do with how much you love your baby. Mental depression is an illness, serious depression, and you can't respond consistently. There's a wonderful program that started in New Haven, Connecticut called the Moms Partnership that focused particularly on mothers with young children, with the mothers who are dealing with depression. And they were dealing with this problem of the fact that people were identified and referred for mental health services and often didn't follow up. The follow-up is very low, partly because of accessibility and stigma and what have you. So they came up with this wonderful idea of renaming the treatment program for depression and anxiety disorders as a stress reduction program, because it doesn't solve the problem of getting beyond the stigma. But when they surveyed parents and they came into the program and asked them their greatest needs, always on the short list was people asked for help dealing with stress. So they called it a stress reduction program instead of cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, which is what it was, and had 90% completing the program. So part of this issue is to be creative, but how to connect people with services in a way that is acceptable to them and that is accessible and easy. In the long run, the challenge clearly is to change attitudes about mental health. Maybe one of the positive things that come out of this pandemic, the massive levels of anxiety symptoms and depressive symptoms and true disorders across all income groups, across all social classes, across all races and ethnicities, I think is hopefully going to increase our understanding that mental health needs are real and that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and that we really need to mobilize our resources to make those needs met. And when adults have mental health needs and they have young children, we're helping their children by meeting their adult mental health needs.
2 generations for sure. Our last question that we'll wrap up with is from Dr. Sarah Hinshaw-Fouchelet at Tulane University. What are some examples of effective collaborations between health and education that have resulted in children being better prepared to learn when they get to preschool?
Yeah, another great question. So rather than give a specific example, let me describe where I think some of the best, and most promising collaborations are already happening and really are the foundation on which we need to build. For a long time, going back to the founding of Head Start, which was basically begun as a program with an educational focus, but that connected from the beginning the need to make sure the kids had health care. There was always this understanding that healthcare was important, but it was an adjunct. It was something that needed to be somehow connected, but essentially the programs were education focused. Fast forward 50, 60 years into today, you certainly hear more talk among people about the need to have better coordination between early learning and health. And quite frankly, let's be honest about it, a lot of it is because people would love to see Medicaid funds be more available to pay for many of the services that children need that are not in the traditional category of healthcare, but clearly are important, not traditionally the category of early education, but clearly influence children's readiness to be healthy and prepared to succeed in school. I think the most important collaborations are collaborations that go beyond this notion of an interagency agreement or better referral networks between the two, and recognizing that primary health care needs to be an integrated part of the early care and education system and vice versa. We need the effective collaborations are really looking at kind of community-based service delivery in which it's not a matter of one connecting to the other, but both of them being a part of a coordinated system. At the policy level, a lot of attention is paid to interagency agreements and kind of a potentially sharing funding streams, all of which is a good start, but not the destination. The destination is to understand that there's one science for both, and that we really need to be thinking of them as an integrated system. It's a meaningless distinction for young kids. Where does health end and early learning begin, or development, or vice versa? They're part of the same thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jack, and also to Cade for joining us today for the keynote address. And thank you to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to join us for today's program and subsequent discussions. We're looking forward to a full week of virtual programming in recognition of Early Ed Week. Tomorrow, Tuesday the 23rd at 6 p.m., we invite you to join us for a virtual film screening of Brain Matters. In addition, on Tuesday, we would also appreciate if you could join us in raising awareness for early care and education in our state via our hashtag LA Early Ed Week social media day of action. On Wednesday, February 24th from 9 to 10:30 in the morning, we are co-hosting a virtual child care center tour for elected officials and business leaders with United Ways across Louisiana and Nichols State University. On Thursday, February 25th at 6 p.m., we invite you to join us for a parent forum on childcare hosted in partnership with the Urban League of Louisiana, Stand for Children of Louisiana, the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and the Parent Leadership Training Institute. On February 26th from 8 to 9 a.m., we are hosting a childcare and economy business breakfast briefing alongside the Louisiana Association for Business and Industry. For details on how to tune into this week's programming and learn more about early care and education in Louisiana, please visit us at policyinstitutela.org. And again, thank you so much to Dr. Jack Shonkoff and Dr. Cade Brumley, and for all of our partners and sponsors for helping us open up Early Ed Week 2021. Thank you so much.